なぜ私はあなたの言葉に静かしました。名誉を重んじなさい。上達します。そして吹き替えではなく字幕。私たちはただ苦しむだけで忠実な何でしょうか。Rise of the Ronin is perhaps best well known at this point in time for coming out at exactly the same time as Dragon's Dogma 2, and getting completely overshadowed by it. Developed by Team Ninja and Koei Tecmo, it represents quite a departure from their usual schedule of just releasing Dynasty Warriors every year. Rise of the Ronin is a more story-driven experience where you play as a nameless Ronin in the period of Japan's last shogun. I have obtained all of its trophies to give you as much of a comprehensive opinion of this game as I can. A platinum opinion. I'm now going to show you the structure of the video with timestamps in a spoiler-free way. I know this is going fast, but some of you don't have the patience, and I do want to provide something of value if you clicked on this video and don't want spoilers. Thanks for your patronage, by the way, and do come back to see how our experiences compare. I'm going to start with the story because I think this is the single most detrimental thing there is to this game. It's a huge mess, hard to follow, largely uninteresting, and the issues start really early on. It also tries to do this really weird thing where it gives you choices because it's advertised as a make your own adventure sort of game, while at the same time trying to stay quite faithful to its historic source material. Two very different facets of design that are difficult to be made to work together, but maybe could. They could, not that this game does it, but they could. Then we'll move on to the characters, because a huge part of this game is its cast of characters and its bond system. It's how you unlock some rewards and some extra content. It's a system that I would describe as being there. It exists. The game does it. It's meh. Then we have the combat gameplay, which to be completely fair is quite good and the best part of this game by a mile. It's fast-paced but precise in a way that is engaging, difficult, and satisfying. You've got loads of combat options, including tools, several weapon types, and even several fighting styles. And all of these styles have different animations, special abilities, and tempo. I'd very much describe it as Sekiro but more tenable, while also having a Ubisoft-esque approach, because it seems to have quite possibly more than 500 collectibles and a skill tree system with improvements that range from banal and predictable to that's nice. And then we'll head on over to the woke part, because I think it's funny to look at people having an irrationally angry reaction over the smallest things. I'll conclude by saying that the game itself is pretty mediocre. The combat is fantastic with a lot of depth, while everything else is either bad or boring. It's pretty much the same thing I've said about Dragon's Dogma 2. It's only the second time in a row I've got to say it, and honestly, I'm already bored of saying it. Anyway, spoilers from here on out. Grab your trusty katana, set the voiceover to Japanese, because obviously, and let's get right into it. As much as I know it's rather cliché or uninspired, I want to start from the very beginning, because I think the game makes its first huge mistake really early on, and this mistake trickles down into the rest of the storytelling. Your origins are about growing up in a village that was massacred due to them wanting to rebel against the shogunate. This led to you being part of a special unit called the Veiled Edges, a group of blade twins with fantastic combat prowess meant to overthrow the shogunate. What the game essentially tries to establish is that to your chosen protagonist, their blade twin really matters, and it has to establish that fast because the game kills these few characters that you know at Ubisoft pace. In the very first actual mission, your blade twin is presumed dead or missing, then shogunate forces burn down your village and you kill your master because your character somehow knows your twin might be alive, but he can't leave his clan because that's illegal. You know, despite the clan being pretty much wiped out anyway. Thems are the rules, and now you're a Ronin. Oh, like in the title. Do you see the problem? The game is too concerned establishing this connection between the main character and their blade twin, and to some extent their master too, but fails to establish their rapport with you. The blade twin is important to the protagonist, but not to you. It's the typical Ubisoft introducing a family member and having them killed in the first 5 minutes. And this is a huge problem because a lot of the story is focused around finding this character that you don't really care about. It's a really shallow start that personally didn't really intrigue me, which is a huge problem because as you progress and the main storyline about your blade twin takes precedence, you're left with a narrative experience that feels empty. Like the game tries to reap the benefits of a relationship that it didn't bother setting up or contextualizing. There were many times, especially at the start, where I struggled understanding what the story was actually building towards, and I take this to be very much a failure caused by this poor introductory section. So little did I care about this blade twin that I just didn't think think about how they would fit in the narrative. Let's set them aside for now because they will become more relevant as the story goes on. The plotline that runs concurrently and for the most part takes center stage is the more history-heavy one about the last shogun. For a bit of context, Japan was heavily isolationist, following strict policies forbidding most trade, contact, or getting in and out of the country. This is actually the time period where this would come to an end, with external influences, particularly American and British, exerting their influence to force relationships and treaties. In turn, this also caused unrest, leading to a civil war between the Tokugawa shogunate and the Satsuma and Choshu clans. Also, I should say, here's the mandatory apology if I end up mispronouncing these names. But this is essentially what the game explores, from the pivotal moment when Matthew Perry's Black Ship successfully opened Japan to the US, to the early onset of the uprising against the shogunate, to the Boshin Civil War. This, as a concept for a story, is all well and good and deeply interesting, but the game's execution of it is quite underwhelming. What you'll notice early on is that you're given a few ways to respond, because the game advertises itself as a game where the story changes based on your decisions. Which begs the question, does it?
No.
It usually results in slightly different voice lines, or at most something happening slightly differently, like avoiding a fight. But I can't for the life of me point at something in the story and say that this is where my choice made a difference. This is the typical game studio lie about their story being shaped by your choices, when in reality what you get is a glorified voice line selection menu. This is, in my opinion, damning enough on its own to the maker's creativity and integrity. But it gets much worse because the game really punches above its weight. As the conflict between rebel forces and the shogunate takes center stage, someone had the bright idea of putting you at the forefront of choosing which faction you want to side with. But like, sometimes. The main way this idea secretes itself into the game is not really by choosing an allegiance with one faction, which would result in unique interactions with other factions and really unique playthrough experiences. Instead, there's a few missions where you can select which faction you want to side with, either anti or pro-shogunate. You don't have to stay committed to one faction, and the game itself has story missions and entire chapters and sections that force you to support one faction, usually at the cost of the other. At the start, I was apprehensive in choosing a faction, and that's because the context given by the game is rather light. I get that the shogunate destroyed your village, but the game neglects giving you, the game player, a perspective. Like, sure, we can surmise that the main character hates the shogunate, but from our perspective, are their actions unwarranted? If you were to plan an uprising, of course you'd be at odds with those in power.
When you fuck with the power, you fuck with the power.
Instead, from what I could gather, the reasons to be anti-shogunate were that the administration was somewhat tyrannical and was agreeing to open the country to other nations, while the reasons to be pro-shogunate are... well... nothing? There's nothing. There's literally no reason I came across to be pro-shogunate at this point in time. Now, yes, the game does eventually expand on that, blaming foreigners for the outbreaks of cholera and expanding upon the shogunate's tyrannical rule, as they would host efforts to purge Japan of those who would oppose them. But at the start, the game doesn't establish these points well enough through its narrative, and my choice as to whether I should go pro or anti-shogunate was really based on what sort of makes sense for my character, because the game failed to establish a deeper connection between myself and the story. Now look, I can hear some of you shouting and screaming about how this is history and I should know of it. I am obviously not a Japanese historian. A lot of my time in school was rather spent on Romanian history, which is very useful to me now, but I do think that it's unreasonable to expect everyone who plays this game to be familiar with Japanese history. You need to convey that context, add characters with visible nuances and attitudes, not just to add flavor to your world, but onboard the player into the story. I am convinced that for most players, the game failed to establish these two opposing forces. And I know this sounds like a bold claim, but let me explain why I'm making it. I believe that if the game cannot establish perspectives you can resonate with, the regular player would default to choosing whatever faction the story favors at that point in time. And fortunately for me, the game actually shows statistics as to how many people chose which option. Case in point, the start of the story mainly exposes you to anti-shogunate characters and barely anything pro-shogunate. In fact, so neglected are the pro-shogunate forces that you could put their two entries side by side. Look at that difference. It shouldn't be much of a shock that overwhelmingly players chose to be anti-shogunate. Then we head to the middle-ish of the second chapter, where the story makes you switch sides. You get to know more pro-shogunate characters, the anti-shogunate faction starts becoming a bit too extreme, and from there the most popular choices are pro-shogunate. Again, overwhelmingly. Later still, your boy gets tired of the conflict between the two forces, and then tries to help the anti-shogunate forces because they're essentially getting decimated. And someone from the pro-shogunate camp tries to get Ryoma assassinated. Can you guess which faction was the more popular choice? What's that? The anti-shogunate forces? Muy f***ing bien! Frankly, it's not even you who establishes what faction you follow. In fact, it's Ryoma, the real main character. He starts out on the side of the rebels. He decides that the anti-shogunate forces are becoming too extreme. He switches sides when the shogunate starts decimating the rebels. He decides your faction, not you. This is already a huge narrative failure, but what's worse is that it just doesn't fucking matter. And I find it so funny how even the timeline itself showcases that. Like the timelines just diffuse into each other because what you do doesn't matter to the narrative as a whole. I think if there's one choice that really encompasses everything that is awful about them is when you participate in the assassination of Minister Lee. This is not a mission where you choose your side, the game puts you squarely against the shogunate in this one, but for some reason you're given a choice as to whether to assassinate him or not. This is so nonsensical that I, out loud, asked why. Why would I choose to spare someone who is painted by the story to be cruel and cutthroat? So uncharitable the story is to him that the only other pro-shogunate character at the time betrayed him, and was subsequently assassinated for it. If you were to spare him, you'd think that this would lead to some serious consequences, like your anti-shogunate allies dissenting you. But conveniently, no one sees you spare him, he is stripped of power and gets assassinated anyway. I can understand why the game lets you go back in time to change your choices, because they're all made in a vacuum. Sure, different factions sometimes lead to different mission setups or unlock a few optional quests, which is fine because I like the combat of this game and I will not say no to more of it. But narratively, where it matters, it does nothing. By this point, with all this sloppy flip-flop with all these factions, I started again not being sure what the story is leading to. Like, what exactly am I fighting for or against? When you're put in a faction, it's easier to look at the other side and form a feeling of adversity that carries the story. But you change sides 3 times. Each time because one faction grows too radical while the other one doesn't seem to be that bad anymore. This is already a poor way to build tension towards the climax of the game, because no one seems to be evil or at odds with you, and in the end it doesn't matter anyway. The finale of the game drops the pretense of rival factions entirely, the choices you made had no real consequence, and neither faction was actually inherently bad, because the real villain in all of this was actually your blade twin. And their story takes center stage again. You encounter them a few times in the story, they fight you, refuse to elaborate, and leave.
Bye, bitch. I'm gone.
Their motivations keep being a mystery. The game clarifies that they were brought to America, but nothing really explains what they want until much later. It turns out that their goal is to cause chaos. Wow, what a unique character, definitely never been done before, fantastic villain motivation, pack it the f up writers, this is how you do character. Jokes aside, I don't think I need to tell you that a character being evil for the sake of being evil is boring and uninspired. Their rationale seems to be that by sowing chaos they forge a world where you two will always be necessary, whatever that means.
ようやくお前と生きられるよう作ることができたな。
Girl, Nani the f are you talking about? I have to assume that this is about you being a Ronin, and the land in turmoil would mean that your opportunity to profit is essentially endless. Even your blade twin agrees that the combat of this game is pretty good, so much so that they want to make more of it. But to be honest, I've hardly noticed this game being about you actually being a Ronin. Sure, you can switch factions as we've covered before, like a Ronin would, but I can hardly point out to any narrative element that really capitalizes on you being a Ronin. Like, for a game that is called Rise of the Ronin, you don't do that much rising. As a Ronin, the last quarter of the game is arguably the weakest as it casts aside the conflict for your blade twin. And can I say, what a shame. It throws away a plotline that, sure, has a lot of problems, but is ultimately somewhat historically interesting. And it's done in favor of focusing on a boring and poorly written self-insert of a character. In fact, in my opinion, the second to third acts of the game are the strongest because you have these characters that you build a rapport with, and they all clash physically and philosophically in a way that conveys tension, because they could all die. In direct comparison, the Blade Twin as a villain is a blank slate with a generic edgy personality and really weak and underdeveloped worldview. So, now that we've talked about the Blade Twin, let's segue into another important element to the story. It's time for... most of the characters you encounter are actually based on real people that lived in that time. Naturally, the game does have to take some liberty and fill in the blanks to make them work in this setting. That is fine, I don't really have a problem with that. There are some weird things every now and then, like Ryoma liking Western stuff but siding with the faction that is against them, which honestly kinda confused me a bit with what the anti-shogunate principles actually were, or the Satsuma clan switching sides all of a sudden, which puts a bump in following the story, but all in all, it's neither here nor there. A huge feature of this game is its bond system, which I would say lets you establish deeper relationships with characters, but honestly, does it? They are essentially like a few dialogue options and maybe like a side quest or two. They give you some gifts and some neat rewards for each level. They're actually quite decent rewards, like items, skill points, and fighting style upgrades. But to be honest, I'm growing tired of calling this sort of thing a relationship system. You know, choosing lines and gifting things and calling it a relationship. When I think of a game like Persona where you can hang out with characters, explore their personalities, help them realize themselves while also getting palpable gameplay advantages, that's a relationship system. Persona 5 has a relationship system. Rise of the Ronin has a glorified menu. And because of the superficiality of this system, they created loads of characters with bonds. On my Platinum playthrough, I've got more than 50. This is a lot of characters the game tries to make you care about. Frankly, even at the later parts of the story, the game still introduces them in sets of 2 and 3. And it's so funny to me that the devs seem to realize that, because you're sometimes given the option to ask a character who the f are they? This is like being on Grindr. Did I talk to you before? It's clearly an issue of quantity over quality, because I don't even think the game itself can keep track of how many there are. There's quite a few characters with either one or no bond quest at all, and I'm not saying that those who have more are necessarily better. My issue is that I expect something deeper, like a character arc that fundamentally changes who they are. At most, you've got Kusaka attacking a camp of foreigners and finding out that they're just helping those suffering from cholera, the same disease that he blames them for. It's something that challenges his view of foreigners, being confronted with the idea that his anger is misplaced. This is the sort of stuff I would expect. If you want to make a relationship system good, let me interact with these characters on a deeper level. Don't have them be static puppets that spew personal exposition. Actively let me engage with their efforts of finding and improving themselves. Stop getting giddy about a large number of people I can have a quote-unquote relationship with, and focus your scope on a smaller group you can use to deliver something great. Hades isn't great because I can have a relationship with every single nameless shade. It's great because it had a clear and concise cast of characters with unique designs and stories and a very clear perspective as to how they would fit in. They don't just have their personal quests, but are so alive that they react to everything you do. They carry the narrative so hard that Hades feels fresh even after the game runs out of gameplay content. And yes, I am excited for Hades too. But as far as I'm concerned, whether we're talking about Persona or Hades, these games have set a golden standard in character relationships, and Rise of the Ronin can only dream to barely scratch that. But what I dislike even more is how all of these various characters react to you choosing sides. The word how here does a lot of legwork, by the way. As we've covered before, you will support one faction either by choice or because the story forces you to, and you also have some side content done for characters belonging to either side. Pretty much all of the characters are squarely with one faction or the other. This puts the game in the ideal position of creating a dynamic environment where many characters change their attitude towards you based on what you do. Now, because of how I set this part up, you might expect that the game doesn't capitalize on that fantastic storytelling position. And you'd be right, because it throws it the fuck away. Characters do acknowledge that you've helped or switched sides, so tick, but they don't harbor any negative or impactful sentiment towards you. And look, I get that you're a Ronin and you switch sides, but you cannot tell me that realistically no character would form a strong dislike of you. To really sell me on this bond system with this choice-based narrative, characters should lower their bond with you or outright refuse to deal with you. I think a great example of the absurdity of this idea is related to Kusaka. So, his entire family died to cholera, hence his hatred for outsiders, as he believes them to have brought it to Japan. There is one mission where you team up with Westerners and the final boss is Kusaka. His reaction is pretty intense, and after you defeat him, he walks away angrily.
I I have to laugh. I'm sorry. I can't stand him.
But ultimately, his attitude doesn't change. He'll keep working with you no problem, despite you crossing a very sensible line for him. This is how it goes for most characters, by the way. Whenever you're on opposite sides, you fight them and then they have some introspective dialogue and just go away. The game can't commit to killing them off because historically, that ain't how it works. And this game really wants to be Assassin's Creed, so it tries to maintain some semblance of historical accuracy. But how far the game goes to do that is sometimes laughable. Like, I get that characters in Japanese material tend to be highly philosophical and introspective, hell, sometimes their death takes a full episode, but there comes a point where this becomes a soap opera. Towards the later parts of the story, where the two factions are at the peak of their conflict, as a pro-shogunate player, you are dispatched to an inn where the rebels are hiding. The final bosses here are the duo of Kogoro Katsura and Teizo Miyabe, and it's very clear that you're here with the intent to put them down. Your character says as much. But after the fight, you kinda have a heart-to-heart until Teizo decides to use a bomb that would let Kogoro escape while taking down their enemies. Upon hearing this, Kogoro just... as I've said before, goes away, and then Teizo turns to you and also tells you to escape. Yes, he warns you, his enemy, to get away. What the fuck? This is actually something that really takes the intensity away from the story, because I thought for a second that the design vision was to have all of these bonds with these characters and actually have them die in this conflict, to really highlight how horrible it is to have this civil war by killing off friends and make the world feel emptier. But after you defeat them, they just kinda kneel over and collapse because the game cannot commit to killing them. In fact, the non-lethality of what you do is shocking considering the weapons you're using. The game does have a non-lethal way of dispatching enemies, either through training weapons or hand-to-hand combat. In fact, some missions encourage you to use them to reach 100% synchronization, so when you're using actual weapons, the stakes are meant to be higher. But if enemies are hard-coded to survive, they survive. Who cares that you ran your katana through them? They literally have plot armor, silly! And can we also talk about how stupid it is to use training weapons and impale enemies with them? Hello? Let's get real. The biggest mistake this game makes is not being able to decide what it wants to be. Either be a historically accurate game or be a choice-defined experience. Lean into the historic material and deliver a narrative experience uncompromised by choices and bond systems, or put history aside and make something uncompromisingly dynamic where your choices actually matter. Don't do both, because clearly it doesn't work out. And I do want to point out, for the sake of transparency, that the game sometimes does ignore history. For example, Ryoma IRL was assassinated, but you can save him. Shinskaku and Okita also die because of tuberculosis, but you can cure them. So the game eventually gets really laxed about historical accuracy. It's also a loss because the game could also give you the choice of saving only one of them, but to be honest, at this point it would be too little too late. Actually, no, hang on, cause I wanna get pedantic. So, I think we can all agree that subs not dubs, right? But can I just say that I would have preferred the Western characters to actually speak English or really broken Japanese? It's so weird to interact with all of these foreign characters speaking perfect Japanese. And there are characters like US or British troops that do say things in English during combat. It's just an obvious detail that takes me out of the immersion. I did at some point switch to English, and I do have to say that the voice actors are actually pretty good. They have a heavy accent when it makes sense, which is what I wanted from the Japanese version. Okay, let's move on. As I've said at the start, I believe that the gameplay is the single saving grace this game has, especially because its combat really elevates it at a level that the story and its characters cannot. In fact, the reason I appreciate that there's a lot of side content and that the story is quite long is because it means that I get to interact a lot more with its combat system. The combat is a chaotic amalgamation where you have to read enemy movements to perform precise counters, as you wear down their stamina to a point where you can perform a devastating special move. In this sense, the combat is kind kinda like a Diet Sekiro. And I'm saying Diet here not because it doesn't have its fair share of complexity, but because it's more approachable and, well, easier. It's a lot more forgiving, with a lot of items and tools to use at your disposal during encounters. But what makes Rise of the Ronin very different from Sekiro is actually variety. And I do want to clarify that this is not inherently a diss at Sekiro, it's just that unlike, say, previous Soulsborne games, Sekiro limits you to only one playstyle that requires a lot of precision and dexterity. It was a very different type of game, which is not bad, it just wasn't for me. Rise of the Ronin is not as precise, but it still tries to keep elements like parries to be just precise enough that the combat is kept engaging, but not to the point where it's unfair or too easy. It's a system that I found very satisfying, having these moments where I'd be hyper-focused on reading enemy movements and land parry after parry before viciously replying. The combat is genuinely a different beast entirely from the rest of the game, and I loved it. It also hits on something that I felt was missing from Sekiro, which is being able to use different types of weapons. You've got quite a few options, from hand-to-hand combat to katanas to greatswords to bayonets. They don't necessarily have the most unique identity in combat between each other, like spears and polearms are kinda similar, and twin swords are like a katana but two. But you do have some unique things, like greatswords which are slow but deal a lot of damage in one swing, or oxtail blades that also use non-lethal melee attacks, or bayonets which lets you play as a pseudo-ranged character. Overall, this is quite a decent amount of variety, but each melee weapon has at least 3 fighting styles, and this makes a good system great. Each style comes with a unique moveset with different combat tempo, unique special abilities and utilities, and the game keeps the combat system fresh because enemies also use different styles, which encourages you to cycle through them in what is essentially a rock paper scissors game. Some of them also have unique quirks, which I love, like a special move that links into the fatigue special attack system, or movesets that parry twice in quick succession, which can make up for you misreading enemy attacks. Then you also have ranged options that are more tactical and precise, like bows and rifles, and stuff you can use on the fly, like revolvers and shuriken. Oh yes, and also a flamethrower. I really like this variety and your ability to cycle through it mid-combat. Hell, when you switch styles or weapons in combat, you actually perform an attack. It's an endearing system with lots of detail and is overall quite a lot of fun. Though I will say that the game has a weird fascination with decapitating enemies, which doesn't always make sense and looks really silly sometimes. A thing I'm sure players will have noticed is that this game is somewhat of a Souls-like, and I'm not saying this because of its death and respawn system or because it essentially has bonfires, but because some doors don't open from this side. Jokes aside, this game is a bit of a Souls-like, and I have some mixed feelings on that. I do think that it's nice to make game overs significant by risking your progress, but there is a noticeable ill fit between the system and the setting. Let's look at Dark Souls, the game that popularized this sort of mechanic. The game establishes the respawn system in its lore, it's why you're drawn to bonfires, and through it also justifies the stake of losing your souls. It's not just a game mechanic, it's a lore piece that adds flavor to a world that already has lots of it. In stark contrast, Rise of the Ronin simply has these things, it doesn't set them up, and as a consequence, make no fucking sense. Death is as final as it gets in the context of this game. Same thing happens when you're allowed to go back in time and change your choices. I mean, it is primarily a critique on how little they matter, that you can change them just like that. But because the game doesn't bother canonizing them, they stand out like a sore thumb of game design at best, and at worst, a really uninspired copy of a much more successful game. In terms of mission structure, whether we are talking about main or side content, things get very repetitive. It's usually a repurposed area with a few enemies, and in the end you get a boss fight. So committed to repeating this structure the game is that sometimes it just forces random characters in, or ends up with the character you're doing something for asking to duel you. In this respect, I actually feel like the game is very similar to Dynasty Warriors, where every session would end up in you facing repeated enemies from a limited cast of characters. But credit where credit is due, the game magnificently handles following someone, because if you run, they run. This is unironically something that some games should study. Main missions, however, are a bit more special, not because they don't follow the structure, they follow it to a T, but it's actually the main co-op component of the game. This is where you get to team up with other players, and honestly, it's pretty chaotic, because it's standard practice to just spam attacks on enemies and they just jerk around weirdly. It's a pretty easy way to take out difficult enemies, because honestly, it looks like their AI doesn't know how to cope with the onslaught of attacks. But if you don't want to play online, online, the offline alternative is pretty good. You can choose bonded characters, and you'll have probably noticed how a few of them have weapon types you cannot acquire. This mode actually lets you take control of them and use their unique movesets. It's another thing that complements the game's fantastic combat quite well. Other online stuff includes player characters you can find and challenge. Sometimes they'll be captured by enemies and you can free them to help you. You can also find dogs players send on pilgrimage, which I actually quite like because Johnny's a good boy. Now, of course, there's more to gameplay than combat. The game is, after all, set in an open world. So you know what that means. 113 chests, 17 landmarks, 49 shrines, 44 photos, 91 fugitives, 100 cats. Jesus fucking Christ. They are quite ubiquitous, and I'm not saying that because they're everywhere, but the word sounds like Ubisoft, so we'll go with it. Some make sense, like areas with public disorder or outlaws, some of which are actually animals, which I don't quite understand. But then, at the other end, we've got stuff like taking photographs or rescuing 100 cats. Granted, at least they're not rocks, and honestly, they are quite cute. At least when they're not floating like a fucking ghost, but there is a quantity over quality situation here, and it ain't a good look. Also, here's another thing. The game separates its maps into smaller regions. The idea is that as you do things, more things show on your map so you can find them easily, which is pretty standard open world stuff. But then they also add factions to it, and this is weird. This is where I thought that whatever faction you're playing with will actually have a role in how you liberate these places, as if you're capturing a region for a faction. But you don't, you actually just make them neutral, as if both factions are your enemy. It's so weird how this game can take so many concepts that on paper sound interesting, like the idea of capturing regions for factions, only for it to deliver the idea of this concept as a map but a bit more colorful. In terms of exploration, you've got your hook and your paraglider. I do find it a bit odd that all of my allies have them and know how to use them, but honestly, it's not that much of a bother. My issue with these things is entirely different. I feel like there's no weight in using these things. Like you can use the hook in quick succession and the laws of physics become a mere suggestion. The paraglider is just opened and closed with no effort at all. Like you can just pop it open to cross roofs and it looks really silly because the game obviously tries to maintain a strong sense of realism. Oh, and don't even get me started on the hook animations where you grab things in combat. Just look at it, they look awful. Some other noteworthy things include the stealth system, which is silly, because you can get into a loud scuffle with enemies and then just pan the camera to one or two guys who have somehow heard nothing, and a new difficulty being unlocked after you finish the game, which is great because if combat is the only saving grace of this game, they may just as well give more of it.
Hey, yo.
I am an occasional connoisseur of weird right-wing cringe. I cannot tell you how funny it is to look at a game, see this sort of flag, and then get really giddy about some weirdos getting mad about it on X-Twitter, probably while also basing their entire opinion of a game on this one singular texture. Predictably, I did come across someone saying that Rise of the Ronin is woke. I wasn't even searching for such an opinion, but it just popped up, which is actually how I think most people come across these sorts of weird opinions. Like you just want to look into a game and some dickwad comes to you with some weird right-wing garbage. Let's take a look at Rise of the Ronin is unfortunately woke, and we're gonna get right into it with point 1. The Bladesmith, a woman defeats 5 trained men, which is bad because it's a girl boss moment, just like a Marvel's movie. Yeah, very similar pieces of media there. Now, they do clarify that they believe this to be inaccurate not because women are not as strong as men, but because Japanese samurai were 100% men. I am now going to present some counter-evidence.
You know what? Maybe I too could be ninja. I want to be ninja.
Oh, wrong footage, hold on. Japan actually had onamusha, a term specifically referring to female warriors. And even though their prevalence did indeed diminish around the time period of this game, their presence is still recorded as late as 1868. So it's not woke, it's just a very real historic possibility. Now, if you're still miffed about a woman dispatching 5 trained warriors, and TBH you can't really surmise how trained they are, let's get real here, you might want to consider that sometimes writers create certain situations simply to convey the skill of a character or their importance. For example, through gameplay, your character kills loads of trained men, but then you, along with the Ryoma, are written to lose to Katsukaishu, as if he's more powerful. The point is that if someone is written to do something, they will do it. It's a writing quirk, it's not that deep or some girl boss moment as if her being a woman is all there is to her identity as a character. Then point 2, the character creators have presets for white and black women. Now this is the point where the cat is really left out of the the bag. It's not just about white or black people in general, but more specifically about them being women. Maybe it is just a writing mistake, but I reiterate, women warriors were a thing. And also, if you consider the premise of the game, the Blade Twins are orphans. It's not like they wouldn't train a girl, or someone of a different race for that matter. If we talk purely on race, despite Japan's seclusion, they did allow the Dutch to be established in Nagasaki. You could theoretically meet a Dutch guy who was like,
I am a samurai.
in fact, you meet someone with mixed parents in your adventure. Black people were also present as early as the mid-16th century, arriving as crewmates or slaves on European ships. Now, the game barely has any black people, sure, but the point is, again, that their presence is a possibility. Then we have the character creator referring to male and female bodies as body type 1 and 2. Now, sure, you could think of this as a consequence of the big bad woke. Some gamers do seem to get pretty angry at the idea of pronouns being a thing anyway. In fact, I'm glad that this person didn't play much of the game, because sometimes characters refer to you or your twin through gender-neutral pronouns, and this would result in some real palpitations. Either way, to me this actually looks kinda funny, like they forgot to name the body types and just left them as type 1 and 2. The gender-neutral line thing could also be explained as a cost-cutting measure, because then you don't have to worry about recording things twice. Anyway, then there's a point about the bladesmith being, gay? Sister, I think that between the two of us, we both know that there's only one gay, and it ain't me. Last point. Before the game starts, you're greeted with a trigger warning about how the 18,000s Japan doesn't reflect the diversity of the people who created the game, nor their values. Now sure, the wording is a bit different. It's not really about reflecting diversity, but about reflecting the ideals of the diverse teams behind the game. But let's call it what it actually is. It's a disclaimer, a warning that is commonplace in media to avoid misconceptions. In the context of Rise of the Ronin, this makes sense. It is, after all, taking place during Japan's isolationist period, where xenophobia, dislike and prejudice against people from other countries, would be commonplace. In fact, the game pushes characters that would share such sentiment to the forefront of its story, although it's really toned down. Either way, considering today's climate, you probably want to avoid such association going from your game to your development team. So again, it's not some woke trigger warning, it's a disclaimer. Obviously. And it's not even meant for the so-called snowflakes that would play it. It's self-serving. In the end, I think it's safe to say that Rise of the Ronin is not a woke game. It's just not that good of a game to begin with. Rise of the Ronin is disappointing. Yes, its combat is fantastic, but if you want 80 euros out of me, I expect more. Games have evolved to be way more than a facilitator for fighting and gore, and if you set a price high, so will I set my expectations. It's a shame, really. I genuinely get excited for games that use Eastern or Nordic motifs and themes, so I was excited to jump into Rise of the Ronin blind. Unfortunately, by the time I completed it, I was disappointed. And look, it's not like the game is a complete car crash. I've harped on about the story and its characters for quite a bit, but it's not like it doesn't have some nice things here and there. What the game really needed is a much clearer vision about what it wanted to be. And I say this lovingly because I can see the commitment and dedication the devs put in their game. And the fact that I can see this despite the game not being a hit with me does say something. Ultimately, I have to ask myself whether this game is really up to par with the level of fidelity I would have expected, and at the end of the day, I have to conclude that sadly, it is not. Well, that was kinda sad. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Rise of the Ronin. Do like and subscribe to the channel to help it with the algorithm. It's kinda like giving a Knot of Destiny to me. Aww. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and have a lovely day. Can I just say, I am proud that I didn't use the Yamate meme in this video. You know, the one that goes like... Oh shit, I used it.